So I've created a few designs previously that combine classical paintings with these kind of vintage modern aesthetic. So I'm going to walk you through how I've created these 3 recent posters on Photoshop. So let's jump straight in and I'll show you the steps. Okay, so moving into Photoshop here, we have our first design. Now this is called The Bridal Veil Fall, and it's by an artist called John Ross Key. And I've sourced all of these images from Boston Public Library, which is a great source on Unsplash. So if you come onto unsplash.com and type in Boston Public Library, you get all of these kind of classical paintings. Okay, let's move into a new canvas here. So we've got a standard 3840, 4800 pixels, 300 resolution. So I'm just going to paste in the image here. Now my first thought when I pasted this in was, how am I going to structure this layout wise? Now because it's a narrow piece, I thought placing this on one side and having the text down the other side would be the best layout. So I'm going to shift this over to the left. Now I'm going to come up to View, Guides, and New Guide Layout. So now from here you can construct your margins and everything that you need. I'm going to use columns just to try and manage the space, because this seems like a 2/3 on this side, 1/3 on this side. So I'm going to put in around 3 columns, increase this gutter to about 100. So I'm just going to come up to these align tools, select align to canvas, make sure this is center aligned, and then I'm just going to slightly increase this to come up to the grid line. So now we have a perfect grid layout with 3 columns, 2/3 and 1/3. So now from this point, my next step was considering the background color. So I've come onto my background layer and unlocked it. And now instead of just command backspacing to fill, I'm going to use a color overlay because it's easier to visualize and cycle through different colors. So come down to effects and color overlay. And then my initial step with these kind of paintings is, because they're all got quite washed out colors, I will use the eyedropper tool and just kind of scale over it to see if I can pick out colors that I like. So consider the contrast here. So the majority of this image is quite dark, so I thought going for a lighter color would be better than a darker one. See, dark can work well. That's quite a nice green there. But for this, I opted for a bit more of an orange off of this mountain. So I never use these as an exact guide. So for example, I could pick colors over here and try and get the exact color I want. What I'll do is I'll eyedrop it, get to a kind of rough color that I like, and then adjust from there on the color selector. So I'm going to get to this kind of orange here, bring it a little bit more into a vibrant orange. I'm going to say about here is good for me and just hit OK. So now for the typography, I'm using a typeface called High Rise. So I'm going to type in Bridal Veil. I'm just going to increase this in size and open my grid lines back up with Command:. Now I'm going to open up this properties panel and play around with the tracking. With the leading, so that I can bring these lines closer together. Now I'm going to use my transform tools just to extend this to the full width of the column. Now because this is going to be the longest word in the column, I can just extend it to the column width, because then we know that everything else is going to be within the bounds. And now with this selected, I'm going to set the color. So I'm going to come back into my eyedropper, come somewhere on the clouds here, and I want a little bit of a bright white, but a little bit off-white. As you can see, it's coming into the kind of yellowy orange hues. So that's good. Now I'm going to Command J to duplicate this, type in the word the, and I'm going to size this down using the golden ratio. So divide it by 1.618. Now I'm going to do the same thing after duplicating it, and I'm going to type in full. Now as you can see, this is a bit more of a tight squeeze down here, so I may shrink the text a little bit more. So as this is 120 right now, I'm going to go down to about 110, bring that over so that there's enough space between the letters, and make sure that these are all aligned. I'm also going to move this down so that the leading is equal. And there we go, that's the main title typeface in. So now the reason I use this typeface is because obviously, as I mentioned before, this is kind of a vertical themed poster. Everything's quite tall and narrow. So going for a tall and narrow typeface is perfect to mimic this. So now going along with this theme, I kind of wanted these thin lines to kind of accentuate this layout. So I'll come over to the rectangle tool. I've got my grid lines back up, and I've just made in a few rectangles here. I'm going to set the fill color as the same as the typography, remove the stroke, and then duplicate this with Command J and bring it up to the top. Now, this isn't always necessary. When I made the poster before, this is exactly what I went for, and I thought it worked quite well. I think even without, it would be completely fine. But what I am going to do is I'm just going to shrink this one a little bit, maybe even make it a little bit thinner, and then just duplicate that one back down. Now with these both selected, I'm going to use Command T, and I want to center it within this column. And now I can add in the body text here. So I'm going to make a text box, the width of this column, and I'm going to paste in the text from the other design. But you can see all I've done here is use the golden ratio again. So this doesn't have to be exact, you doesn't have to stick to it perfectly, but I've just come into the type box here, divided the subheading by 1.618, and then shrunk it down. So from this point, all you have to do is adjust your leading. So I've got it quite closely gapped here. I'm using the exact same typeface. And then what I did with the color. So I'm just going to drag this up slightly, make sure that this is all formatted right. Now, I'm actually just going to adjust that color again. I'm going to make it slightly more pale. So I'm going to select this yellow here, and I'm just going to take out a bit of the yellow hue. Move it over to a bit more of this kind of color here, a bit beigey. Now, once again, with this formatting, I'm going to Command J to duplicate this, and I'm going to right align it so I can put in this kind of corner text here. I'm just going to name this Yosemite Valley. Now I'm just going to drag in my logo just to add as an asset. And then once again, effects, color overlay, drag a color off of the image using the eyedropper tool. I might just use the same color as the type here. I think I've extended that slightly. And then just adjust your sizing and go from there. So now coming out, it's looking quite good in the typography setting. So I think we've got nearly all the type in. I'm just gonna add in a few more small assets just to kind of accentuate that grid a bit further. So I'm gonna come onto the rectangle tool, drag in a square down here in this corner, duplicate that. And now I'm gonna group those both. Command J, duplicate this, drag this across. You know, very simple stuff here. Group those, duplicate, drag up to the top. Now I love doing this because obviously there's a perfect measurement here of a square using the column and grid layout. So putting these kind of squares in makes it a little bit more of a modern aesthetic, which ties in quite nicely with the design. So now with all of the assets added, we can just move on to texturing. So for texturing this piece, what I've done is I've combined the assets into a group. So I'm going to highlight everything except for the image, Command G to group it, and just name it assets. And now I'm going to duplicate this and convert this to a smart object. Now the reason I do this is so that I can add on effects and I'm able to go back and edit them if needed. So with this layer selected, I'm going to come on to Filter, Distort, and Displace. Now I'm going to add on about a 20 scale, and I'm going to select this film dust texture that I have in order to displace it and get this kind of subtle distress look. Now I think this distress look works really well with the style of painting. So you can see now, got these really subtle distressed edges, kind of like splat visual. I think this ties in really well with the aesthetic. So I'm just going to click on this layer and I'm going to adjust it just to bring it back within the grid lines, and then I can use the arrow keys just to adjust it further, make sure it's all perfect. So with our texturing added, I'm just going to add in a texture layer here. Now I went for a paper texture layer. Now this is from Design Syndrome, I'll link it in the description. And I'm going to set the opacity to about 30. And the good thing about this layer is that it covers every color. So you can see here that the text and the background and the image have all been covered by the texture. So it ties it all in really nicely. So that is our poster 1 complete. Okay, now moving on to poster number 2 here, we've got this poster design called Valley. So I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and you can see it's got this large typographic title, a half and half composition top to bottom with another classical painting image. So I'm going to grab this image and start a new canvas. Now we're going to use the same settings as before, 3840, 4800, 300 resolution. So first step is pasting in the image. Now, as soon as I sourced this image from that same Boston Public Library page, I immediately thought, okay, landscape format, I'm going to do a top and bottom kind of half-half design. So I dragged this straight to the bottom and then I went into my grid lines again. Now I follow the same sort of steps every time I make these kind of designs. I can base it around the image, or you can make the type and then base the image around that. So I'm going to come up to View, Guides, New Guide Layout. Now for this one, I wanted to use a little bit tighter margins because when you're working with kind of a horizontal aspect ratio, you want to bring in the assets a little bit more. So I doubled the margins here and went for 200, and I'm just going to maintain the columns as they are now, but I'm not really going to use them. So I'm just going to keep them there just as a loose guide. Now you can do this as well. You do not need to stick to these by any means. It's just there to kind of help you out. So once again, I'm going to unlock my background layer, click the lock, come down to Effects and Color Overlay. Now with this selected, once again, I'm going to follow my eyedropper tool and I'm going to opt for a light color. Now, when I'm looking at colors here, what I'm looking for, especially in this format of layout where it's horizontal and top and bottom, is I kind of want the color to blend somewhat seamlessly with the top of the image. So I'm going to use a white here because the majority of the sky is clouds. Whereas if I was adding it onto the bottom of the image, I'd be opting for a darker color somewhat of these leaves. So for now, let me just walk over the clouds, see what kind of color I can pick out here. And I'm going to stick around here. Set that as okay. And now for this kind of large typographic headline, I'm just going to type in the word, which is Valley. I'm going to set this as left aligned. And I can just use my transform tools to scale this up. So this word composition wise, in terms of like how long the width is, fits perfectly within a top and bottom composition. So I'm going to hold Option, extend this to the transform tools. I'm going to extend this to the margin lines and then just drag that down to the top of the margin line here. So now from this point, without trying to take the text out of proportion, you have some options. Because the top of the margin does not match under the type, you can create a rectangle here instead of using a grid line. And I'm just going to shrink this to the size of the margin. So then I can bring this underneath the Valley text. And we now know that with a grid line, drag it in from the top, that is where the image needs to come up to in order for this top typography to be balanced. So the options you can take from here are Command T. You can just increase the size of the image. Now it will cut out some edges, but if you feel like it isn't necessary to have, that can be one route. Now the other route is using this rectangle you just made, dragging it above the image, and then making sure that some sort of type assets come down to this point. So you could extend the type, or you could add in some more typography here so that you have these margins fixed. Now in this case, I'm just going to drag this below the text and I'm going to increase the size of this image just so it matches there and then hide that. So I think that in terms of composition on this image, we can then just drag this left and right to see what fits the best. I think this works completely fine. So now it comes to adding in this kind of label. I can see now on the original that I've just extended the title, but I'm going to add in this text here. So I've simply grabbed a rectangle tool and I've made this kind of patch design and just dragged it over the top. Now, in terms of color, I've opted for an orange. I'm going to say I'm biased because orange is definitely my favorite color, but instead of using the fill here, I'm going to use color overlay just so it's easier to navigate, because every time you release your click, it's going to change it straight away. So I think I would have dragged around the rocks, and I can see this kind of orangey hue here, kind of like a rust color. So from this point, I would have thought, okay, if I can make this slightly more vibrant, it can be enough contrast to kind of stick out in the piece. So even as I increase this diagonally into the bit more of the more vibrant hues, I'm going to settle around there. I think in terms of contrast, it goes very well with white and black and this kind of off-white and gray. So this works for me. So now you just want to place the label in a point where you feel like it doesn't interrupt the lettering. So for example, if it was there, you're not going to read this as Valley. You know, it's blocking out part of the E, blocking out part of the I. You have to place it in an area where you feel like you can still read the lettering easily without having to strain on it. So this is good for me. Might just drag it across a little bit there and drag it a little bit down. So now once again, I'm just going to add my type tool. I'm going to add in the second part of the title here and just simply use the transform tools to extend this. I'm using the same typeface. I think in pieces like this, where you've got these insanely good classical paintings, I think using loads of typography kind of just takes away from it. So I wanted to keep it really simple. Now this painting was by Thomas Moran. So let me just remove that A. Now I'm just going to scale this down, right justify, and then just place this over on the right hand side here. So I'm just going to make copies, drag them across, and then just retype in what I want to use. So type in my handle, Boston Public Library. Now I can just command click on these two, select my color, and I'm just going to tap on this background here and make them this kind of like background whitey hue, just for a little bit of contrast. So I'm going to make sure everything is deselected, and I'm going to repeat the same step as the last poster, where I'm going to group all of the assets here. Command G to group this, and I'm going to duplicate, convert that to a smart object, and hide the original. Now, I'm going to use the same displacement method, 20 scale, and I'm going to select the same film dust texture. Once again, creates these cool, subtle, but detailed look. I'm going to use my arrow keys to just adjust it back in within the grid lines, and then we're going to place in our overlay. Once again, using the same paper texture, I find that these PNG paper textures with a little bit of stress on them work very well on this style of painting, because it kind of makes it all quite comprehensive and it overlays every aspect of the photo. So I'm just going to turn the opacity down to maybe about 30. Still got this detail coming through on the black color and the white color, as well as all other colors in the image, and the text is nice and distressed. Now that is our second poster done, so let's move on to poster 3 and the final one. And moving on to our third and final poster design, we have Boulder Park. Now again, another classical painting that I've sourced from Boston Public Library. And you can see now this is slightly different composition wise. This is more of a full-size image. So let's jump into a new canvas. I'm going to show you the reasoning. So again, same settings in the poster canvas. So we're going to do 3840, 4800, and I'm going to bring this image in here. So apart from the size of it, you see if I scale this down to full size, my immediate thought was portrait orientation. This is already the same kind of scale as the poster designs I do usually. And composition wise in the image, there is enough flat color so that we can use text over it, and it's not going to be an issue of contrast. So we can either pick the sky, the mountains here, the mountains here. I'm looking for areas that have similar colors the whole way through, so that when we place text over it, it's still easy to read. So here I've opted for a full size, so I'm just going to hold option, drag this full scale, and then from this point just shift and drag it up and down to see what you think works best within your canvas bounds. So I'm going to say around there is good for me. Once again, moving into grid lines. So view, guides, new guide layout. Now this one for me, slightly more lenient because it's not as if I'm going to be putting chunks of text on it. I've only really got a title and a top bar. So I'm going to set the margin just to 100 just to keep it thin. Columns, I'm going to get rid of. I'm just going to use the margins for this one. So I wanted to create this kind of like combination of typography of mixing the script with the sans serif, just for contrast, as well as using the colors that are very vibrant against the background image so they stand out really well. So for the typeface Boulder here, we're going to be using the same as the previous poster, where we're going to be using High Rise Demo from poster 1. Now this is on condensed. I'm going to set this to bold. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come onto our type settings, our character settings here, select this on optical so that the spacing is a little bit closer. Now you can see with the size of this heading, it's a good enough size right now to be a heading. You think if we went a little bit bigger, we're going to have problems with contrast against the river. So keeping it within this area, this size is optimal right now. So now I thought color-wise, I'm going to repeat the same step. So with a type layer, just press T, select our color up the top. And again, use the eyedropper tool, see if you can get any sort of ideas from this. This is mainly just for creating ideas rather than selecting your text color straight away. So from this point, I'm kind of gauging the hues. So I've got this kind of color I've selected here up on the mountain. And I'm going to drag this into the more vibrant section. You can see here the orange is working slightly well, but I think I need a little bit more contrast. So that's when I would have selected and gone up into the yellows. Now I want to find a good midpoint between this. I'm actually going to make it more vibrant. And I believe my thought process here was that even with this yellow, we're still having subtle issues with contrast here. So you can see this kind of placement behind the rocks. So I'm going to set OK for now. I think this color works overall. If I zoom out, you can read it. If I zoom in, you can read it. But in order just to kind of accentuate this, I'm going to add a stroke. So I'm going to come on effects and stroke. And I think adding in this stroke also ties in with the overall aesthetic. So I think it's not a problem at all. So I'm going to set it to outside and I'm going to keep it maybe about 5 here. Might make it slightly less, set it to 4. Okay, now for the contrasting typography of the script font, we're going to use Command J to duplicate this. And I'm going to type in Park. Now with this, I'm going to come up to my script typeface, which is called Sloop. And I have 3 different variants here. You can see how it changes the lettering slightly. I'm going to go for script 2 because you've got this really nice P letter here. And now this is when we're going to play with the contrast color of the text. So moving back into those bright hues, I came down into the reds and you can see it's a little bit too vibrant. It sticks out a bit too much. It doesn't kind of settle in with the colors of the image. So let's just bring that up slightly more into an orange and you see it's a little bit lighter now. And then you can play around with the contrast against this. I'm going to say about here is good for me. Shrink this down and I'm going to place it over the top. Now, I think because the P is quite out there, you see it's got all of these kind of like letter forms extending. I'm going to opt for the other option. So I'm going to come back into my typeface and I'm going to cycle between them again. See script 1, that's a good option. It's a little bit easier to read. I'm going to see what script 3 is like. I like this kind of extended K, but again, I think it's a little bit more harder to read. So I'm going to keep it how it is now and I'm going to make sure that with these script fonts, you want your tracking set to metrics because often it can ruin the letter forms if you have it on optical. So now I'm going to highlight both of these and I'm going to center align them and drag them back so that I know that they are scaled themselves. Now from this point with my title done, I realize I just need to add in the location. So I'm going to duplicate Boulder, bring that down, type in Colorado. And now, didn't want it the full size. Obviously as the word Colorado is longer than Boulder, I thought there's not really a way that this can be the same size as it because it takes over. It doesn't look like a title anymore. So I'm going to use my size scaling here and I'm going to shrink this down. Then I'm going to make it into a bit more of a kind of like subheading just by increasing the tracking here. I'm going to set it to about 300. I can make the size a little bit smaller, maybe about 45. And then from this point, I can drag it center aligned with Boulder, just about there. And now the text hierarchy is clear here, so you can still read all of it. I'm going to make Park slightly bigger, and then I'm going to make all of it slightly bigger. So from here, this is center aligned perfectly. You can see our pink margins are showing us that. Keep the scale here. Now, as I zoom out, you can see that this composition is working quite well. The colors are all readable. It's all very clear. And now I just wanted to add in a few more small type assets. So I was considering where I'd place it. I thought I could add in a body text in this area, make it a really small typeface, even using the same type. But I thought might be a bit of a challenge to read, might take away from the kind of contrast of the typefaces here. So my second idea was to add in a bar on the top. So I'm going to get the rectangle tool, drag this across the top, add a color overlay again. For any kind of vibrant color here would take away from the contrast. So I want it to settle in and kind of blend with the image in a bit more of a darker hue. So again, use the eyedropper tool, drag over these kind of darker colors, and I'm going to settle for about there. And once I take my margins away, it's already nearly barely noticeable, which is what I'm going for. So now with this within the margin, it's going to get my type tool, set the size to about 12, and I'm going to go for just a standard sans serif. So I'm going to go for Forma DJR. I'm just going to add in some type along the top here. So I put my handle in. I'm actually going to shrink this size down to 10 point, make sure that's center aligned with the rest of the piece. And I'm also going to eyedrop this to make it the same yellow color as the title. So now drag that across to this point, Boston Public Library. This was poster number 481 of 500. Just going to throw graphic design in there as well. And now, because I want these equally spaced across the top bar, what I can do is I can make sure that my handle there is the bottom layer, Boston Public Library is the top. And then if I shift and select all of these, I can come up to the align tools, select the 3 dots and click this icon here, which is distribute spacing evenly. Now this is for horizontal, this is for vertical. So you can see now that they're equally spaced. So we don't have to worry about trying to do that manually. And now I've all of our typography in, we can do the same kind of displacement steps. Now it's just a standard for what I do in this style of poster because it works so well aesthetically with the images. So group it all, duplicate, smart object, filter displace. Once again, using that film dust texture. Okay, so now with the displacement applied, you can see here it's kind of increased the sizing between the text and the top bar. So once again, use your arrow keys to adjust this, place it back where it should be, get your grid lines out so that you know it's aligned. And there again, we are back in business. So now let's just add in a texture layer. Surprise, surprise, same texture layer as before. It just works amazingly with these kind of designs. Set the opacity down to maybe 30. And there we go. We've got this texture applied evenly across everything. If you wanted to adjust the contrast, select the texture layer, Command L. From this point, you can play around with the levels and you're going to notice that, let me increase the opacity first so you can see it more. Play around with the contrast between the mids, the lows and the highs. Now this brings out a little bit more texture. You can see it's almost a bit more of a noise effect, like grainy wise. For me, I'm happy without the levels, just at the 30% opacity. But yeah, just gives you some more options to play with. And that is poster 3 complete. Right, and that is us all finished. So thank you very much for making it to the very end. I hope you found the video useful. YouTube's going to recommend you another one just here that it thinks you want to watch. So go ahead and do that. I'll see you in the next one.